as we're going to be covering parts two and, well, as we're going to be finishing part two, because we didn't get fully into the Battle of Antietam in part three, I do want you to keep in mind as we're going through here that so many of these soldiers were wearing thick wool uniforms during the middle of summer, and the dehydration during this time period must have been terrible. So just a little detail I wanted to put in there. But as usual, I usually wait about 5 minutes before the start of a program for everyone to come in. So I would like to quickly touch upon what we were discussing last week before we go into the subject of today, which is mainly the year 1863. So we touched upon the Peninsula Campaign, the Battle of Hampton Roads, the First Battle of the Ironclads, and of course the 7 Days Battle outside of Richmond, where General Robert E. Lee assumed command of the Army of Northern Virginia and was able to successfully drive off the Army of the Potomac with Union General George McClellan commanding, even though McClellan overwhelmingly outnumbered his opponents. So let me quickly go over here. So we did visit this a little bit at the end of our discussion, which was the question of emancipation. Abraham Lincoln made it very clear in his first inaugural address that he did not want to pursue emancipation as a form of essentially national unity. He didn't think it would unite the country. If anything, he has been quoted saying that he believed that if he were to emancipate all the slaves, I believe the expression he used was it would cause another 1 million men to throw down their arms and another 4 states to secede. So very quickly, when it comes to emancipation, which the truth is, emancipation is going to be playing a major role in our entire discussion today when it comes to the beginnings of 1863 and then ultimately the conclusion of it with decisive Union victories in the East and the West. Emancipation was first proposed by Abraham Lincoln to his cabinet on July 13, 1862. According to the descriptions that we have, his cabinet was completely surprised by this. No one was expecting it. They truly took Lincoln at his word. And I want to say, as someone who has taught many classes on Machiavelli, Lincoln was a master at politics, meaning that he was incredibly talented at having this reputation as honest Abe, even though behind the scenes he was an incredibly cunning political genius, in my opinion. And when it comes to his own cabinet being surprised, that gives you a good idea of showing just how expert Abraham Lincoln was at shielding his own personal views, which were very abolitionist, from ultimately his duties as president and the Herculean challenge that he believed he had, which was to unify the country. When it comes to emancipation, he truly believed that this was a tactic necessary in order for the Union to win the war. He read his first draft of the Emancipation Proclamation to his cabinet in July 22nd, and New York's own Secretary of State Seward, he was the one who insisted that before the emancipation is issued, we would need a major Union victory. Otherwise, he said, it might be like the last yelp, like before our defeat. So a little bit of New York history being injected into this. I'm always proud of that. So Abraham Lincoln, and again, I really want to make it clear, this is him doing what we would now in politics call a trial balloon. What he's doing is, in this passage over here, which was a letter he wrote to Horace Greeley of the New York Tribune, Abraham Lincoln was deliberately, essentially, pumping his audience. He was testing them to see how they might be able to respond not only to emancipation, but behind his own logic when it came to emancipation. Could someone please read the passage Abraham Lincoln has here?
My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that.
Thank you so much, Mr. President. Look at that date down there, August 22nd. This is over a month since Abraham Lincoln has brought the subject to his cabinet. So again, this man's reputation as honest Abe, I love it. This is someone who's already made the decision and the very risky decision of emancipating slaves, specifically the slaves in the southern states that are in a state of rebellion. And already you can see over here, before it's been issued, he's already preparing the audience for the logic behind it. At the end of the day, his plan is to end the Civil War, and he believes as commander-in-chief of the army, he can do that by depriving the opponents of slavery, which could be used and have been used to benefit the war fighting. So the Union victory that Seward said that Lincoln needed, and which was eventually good enough for Lincoln to work with, was known as the Battle of Antietam, which took place in Sharpsburg, Maryland, in September of 1862. When it comes to the campaign going up there, it's a whole subject of its own. Robert E. Lee, his invasion of Maryland, it was incredibly politically motivated. He wanted to hopefully persuade Maryland into joining the Confederacy. He even had his military band playing Maryland. What is it? Oh, Maryland, my Maryland, as they invaded. And probably the main reason why he's invading the North is because he's trying to persuade the European powers, particularly Great Britain, which had been very much on the fence since the first year of the war. When it came to supporting the Confederacy, he's trying to persuade them to join the Confederates. As we mentioned before, when it came to strategy, and with this class being primarily about military strategy and military science, what the Confederates are doing is essentially a repeat of the American Revolution strategy, which is hold your territory, be able to bait and defeat the opponent's armies, and lastly, to get foreign recognition. Foreign recognition is probably the most important thing the Confederacy would need in order to win this, just as when it came to the American Revolution, we needed European support in order to win that. So the Battle of Antietam, which is known as the bloodiest single day of the American Civil War, we see three major attacks that take place throughout the region of Sharpsburg. The river on the left is actually the Potomac River. We have General Joe Hooker up in the top. We have Sumner over in the northeast. And how many troops per battle? We'll get right into that. It's worth mentioning that in the approach over here, Lee does not have his entire army at first. What happens is his army was split up as he was going through here and was actually in a position where it could have been completely destroyed. I'm going to get into the numbers in just a moment. And as we saw before when it came to the Battle of Shiloh, there were sunken roads that sort of became instant trenches for some of the warfare here. And this is part of the reason why the fighting itself was incredibly bloody when it came to the Battle of Antietam. One description that I heard is that there was I believe it was a wheat field where there was so much shooting that they said every single piece of wheat, corn had been cut down as if you had used a knife, went down on the ground. So as a result, horrific casualties from this one battle. But the important thing is strategically, let me go back a little bit more. For the casualties, when it came to Sharpsburg, the general accepted number is about 24,000 casualties. And in many cases, that includes dead, wounded, missing, etc. And when it comes to missing, not all of the missing soldiers were deserters. As I mentioned before, when it came to artillery that would be used during the American Civil War, if, say, soldiers like these, if they were in a trench position and if they had opponents that were charging at them and a canister blast hit them, there would be no soldiers left to identify, just body parts. So that's part of the reason why so many missing are likely to have been deceased. And not only that, you can also see from some of the soldiers how some of their clothing is undone. If a soldier was wounded in the torso, wounded soldiers would actually tear their clothes off to see if it was a stomach shot or a chest shot. Because if you were shot in the arm or the leg, a limb could be amputated. If you were shot in the torso, that was a mortal wound at the time. They wouldn't be able to treat that. And yeah, how many troops are in the battle? I believe for the Confederates, it's about 56,000, and for the Union, it's slightly more. It's like I said, when it comes to the Battle of Antietam, it's a battle where different armies were coming in very rapidly throughout the day. It is a one-day affair and a very bloody one as well. But the really frustrating thing about the Battle of Antietam is you probably heard the story about the 3 cigars. What happened is the Union actually found General Lee's orders to divide his army when he was invading Maryland. It was found in a field wrapped around 3 cigars. And even though the Union got their hand on Lee's movements, where he was very vulnerable, he split in half, General McClellan excruciatingly waited before capitalizing on that. So it cost the Union precious time. I'm not exaggerating when I say this. The Battle of Antietam was, in terms of military fighting, a draw, but strategically it was a victory for the Union because it caused Lee to abandon his invasion of Maryland and ultimately retreat back to Virginia. But I'm not exaggerating when I say this. The Union could have potentially destroyed the Army of Northern Virginia, or at least captured enough of it to render its military fighting almost useless. So with the repulse of the Army of Northern Virginia, for Lincoln, that's good enough. That's his victory that Seward recommended. He issues his Emancipation Proclamation. Could someone please read this for us? We're going to be going through in several pages. Could someone please first read this section?
A proclamation. All persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then, thenceforward and forever, free, and the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authority thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So this is going to be the beginning of the entire strategy Lincoln uses with the Emancipation Proclamation. Not only are they free, it is now the duty of the United States Army and Navy to recognize the freedom and the safety of those people. Continuing on, could someone please read this passage?
I further declare and make known that such persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed services of the United States to garrison forts, positions, stations, and other places, and to man vessels of all sorts in said service. And upon this act, sincerely believed to be an act of justice, warranted by the Constitution upon military necessity, I involve the considerate judgment of mankind and the gracious favor of Almighty God.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. So now this is, these two passages are excerpts from the Emancipation Proclamation. There's a large section of it which is very lawyerly. We're specifically saying which parts of the South the Emancipation does not apply to. Abraham Lincoln, in his wisdom and after consulting with his war cabinet, came to the conclusion that the best way logically they could persuade the Emancipation Proclamation to be accepted by the border states of Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri was to have it only apply to the parts of the Confederacy that were still in rebellion. So this does not include portions of Louisiana or Florida that are currently occupied by Union forces, because his rationale is that the Union is already there, so it's no longer in a state of rebellion. This is the reason why the Emancipation will not be applying to the border states. He's using the logical approach that as commander-in-chief, it is his duty to use special powers, executive authority, when it comes to putting down insurrection. So this is ultimately an incredible execution of executive power as President of the United States, one that he lays out the rationale that he is allowed to do because of his constitutional oath to preserve and protect and defend the Constitution. This actually gives him a little bit of, it's in terms of the elasticity of presidential powers, this actually does not in many ways violate what he said during his first inaugural address, where he said that he did not believe he had the authority to interfere with slavery. He did not have, by his own rationale in this document, the authority, because it wasn't allowed to him yet, because there had not been an armed insurrection yet. So from a lawyerly perspective, this is brilliant on Abraham Lincoln's part. And probably the biggest consequence of this, in addition to the recruitment of soldiers, about 200,000 Black soldiers eventually served in the Union Army. Some of them freed slaves, some of them freed men to begin with. And when it comes to Abraham Lincoln himself, he called them the turning point of the American Civil War. When it comes to this final passage, where he says that this is an act of justice warranted by the Constitution upon military necessity, this is Lincoln slamming the door on any possibility of the British Empire supporting the Confederates. The Union is now taking the stand of slavery being a moral wrong, and that the idea of the eradication of slavery and the freedom and even the arming of the victims of that institution, that is an act of justice that the US military is going to be doing. So politically, diplomatically, even though this document in practice didn't really accomplish too much within the southern states, it is a masterpiece of political maneuvering and international diplomacy on Lincoln's part. The sum of all the founding fathers were never able to come up with an adequate solution to how to eradicate slavery in the country. What they did try to do is they tried to put a tourniquet on it, keeping it where it was, and trying to prevent it from spreading elsewhere. So this is Abraham Lincoln's response to it. And again, this is something where out of his entire cabinet, probably William Seward, more than the other cabinet members, plays a very crucial role in how this was being crafted. So before we go on, this is one of the most consequential actions any president has taken in American history. I'm just curious, you've heard Abraham Lincoln's arguments over here, heard his rationale, his belief in his authority. I'm just curious for this discussion, how many of you think that Abraham Lincoln had the authority to institute the Emancipation Proclamation? And how many of you believe he did not have the authority?
He had the authority under the war powers, either that were granted by the Constitution or that he assumed. More correctly, I think he assumed certain war powers, and he was very clear in all of that legalese stuff in the Emancipation Proclamation that he was only doing it for reasons of the war, because the slaves were being used by the Confederacy to support the troops. And in fact, that's why in the areas where the Union had already conquered, the slaves were not set free. And that's why they were not set free. That was a legal reason. Practically, he couldn't set them free in the border states that had slavery. But the legal reason he was giving for not setting them free in those states was because they were not being used by the Confederacy against the Union Army. So he was very, very careful, because he knew that slavery was legal under the Constitution. So he was very, very careful to phrase this in such a way that it would be constitutional, because he still had that Supreme Court, which did not love him. And he had to be make sure that they could not declare his act unconstitutional.
Thank you very much. And also thank you for bringing up the Supreme Court when it comes to this, because I know that there has been quite a lot of discussion when it comes to circumventing the Supreme Court and also controlling the makeup of the court in the last few months. Make no mistake about it, the Republicans during the Lincoln and the Grant administration, and even during the Johnson administration, the Republicans in Congress, they were incredibly clever when it came to changing again and again the amount of numbers of the justices of the Supreme Court in order to not have a Supreme Court justice eradicate all the efforts and the progresses that they had made during the Civil War and ultimately abolition. We have one comment over here from Andrew Riley. Lincoln had the authority to send troops. If they won, his power supported. If they lost, no power. This is actually a pretty fair argument. And this is one of the things about the Constitution that is an unfortunate reality of it. So many powers in the Constitution only become constitutional powers as long as the person who's executing them gets away with it. I mean, when it comes to the Civil War, I mean, the Union could have been defeated. Abraham Lincoln could have lost re-election in 1864, and his opponent, George McClellan, could have negotiated an armistice with the South. The South could have seceded, could have perpetuated slavery. When it comes to Lincoln's assassination, I have read very persuasive essays that if Lincoln and Grant and Johnson and Seward were all assassinated as the John Wilkes Booth conspiracy attempted, that we didn't really have the mechanism in place for a widespread decapitation of the federal government and also the army. So in that case, the United States could have suffered something akin to cardiac arrest with the loss of so much leadership. But yes, when it does come to the Emancipation Proclamation, this is an immense gamble on Lincoln's part. It's one that, according to Ed Bears, John Brown historian and tour guide over at our national parks, I've interviewed him on the subject. He believed that Lincoln and the Union would not have won the Civil War had it not been for the Emancipation Proclamation. He believed that Lincoln had already attempted unsuccessfully to win the war, without emancipation, and that it was a failed strategy. Militarily, we could have won. We did have opportunities, such as mentioned with the Battle of Antietam, when realistically the Army of Northern Virginia could have been separated and destroyed. Lincoln also had very seldomly discussed opportunities to have generals from other countries helping the Union. One of them was General Garibaldi from Italy. He had actually offered his services over to the United States for the purpose of emancipation. And it was for that reason that Lincoln refused the offer to have him in 1861.
I guess I have a question.
Yes.
Would the Constitution, I thought that slavery was permitted under the Constitution. And so here it's saying that it would be an act of justice warranted by the Constitution seems surprising. Maybe that upon military necessity is the key to his being able to say that.
Yeah, so when it comes to the Constitution, and again, this is where we see in full display the unfortunate pliability of the Constitution. When it comes to the Supreme Court under Chief Justice Taney had already made the decision in the Dred Scott decision that slavery was protected by the Constitution and that nothing anybody can do to interfere with it can interfere with it. When it comes to Abraham Lincoln, what he's saying is that the threat posed by secession and by his duties as president to preserve the Union and the Constitution is something that supersedes everything. He's simply saying the Constitution cannot allow to be the authority of the country if the country has disintegrated. He's also made the argument before that the Confederacy could not have seceded because they joined the Union, the individual states, by a pact when it came to everyone else. It's almost like something akin to a marriage, where there's more than one party in the marriage and it requires more than one party to end the marriage. And lastly, he had the opinion that the Constitution did not essentially have, for lack of better terms, a self-destruct button. He did not believe that the Constitution or the founders, when they created it, ever intended for it to be allowed to be undone, specifically when it comes to civil war. Civil war is how all of the republics of antiquity collapsed. And it's something that the founders would have known about, they've written about in Federalist Papers, and they would have tried to avoid that. So what he's saying is he's using the War Powers Act, which is actually quite modern of him as a president. He's essentially using the argument that as commander-in-chief of the United States military and as defender of the United States Constitution, that he has powers allowed to him as commander-in-chief to use whatever powers necessary in order to protect the Constitution, even if it is from armed insurrection. So
well, the Wars Power Act was, sorry. The Wars Power Act is a 20th century act, isn't it? 1970s, I think.
Exactly. And what Lincoln is doing is essentially a precursor to it. He's exercising it before it has been passed. And the main people who can stop him when it comes to this could be the Supreme Court. However, when it comes to Lincoln's relationship with Chief Justice Taney, Abraham Lincoln actually considered arresting and backed off when that was being challenged. Also worth mentioning, so many Southern senators had actually seceded, and they were no longer in the United States Congress to be able to oppose this. So what he's doing is incredibly modern. This is the same kind of logic that a president today using the War Powers Act would use when it comes to, say, invading Iraq or Afghanistan for a certain amount of time. We have a lot of comments in here that I'm quickly going to read. So we have all right now from Ron. Let me see, I'm going to need my glasses for this. So the emancipation did have an immediate and practical application in that the enslaved people in the South became aware of it. Thereafter, whenever Union troops came close, they took the opportunity to flee and cross over to the Union. This became a significant drain on Southern resources. It also hurt them psychologically because slaveholders believed their own lie, that most slaves were happy. As a result, they were upset emotionally when loyal slaves would flee. The Constitution hedged the bet on slavery. It prohibited the importation of slaves after 1803, and it protected all property. So it hinged on the definition of property that was decided by the courts. Yes, it is worth mentioning that when it comes to the Constitution as a document, the Constitution was very careful to avoid the language of slavery. And specifically, when it comes to, say, the last major action by those who had lived during the Revolution and who had actually, in some cases, signed the Constitution. The last major effort that we see when it comes to them with respect to slavery is the Missouri Compromise, where they really had the opinion of containing slavery where it was, allowing it in the southern states, but not allowing it to spread into the new territory purchased during Louisiana and ultimately acquired during the Mexican War. That is going to be completely undone when it comes to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, where in order to continue working on a transcontinental railroad, that we see efforts to add new states and allow them to decide for themselves through popular vote whether or not to be slave-free states. That undoes the initial approach that the founders had when it came to slavery. And let me quickly see over here from Andrew Riley, Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1 of the original Constitution prohibited Congress from passing laws that banned enslavement until the year 1808, 21 years after the signing of the original Constitution. Peter writes, this was an executive order written at the limits of Lincoln's powers. It sheds some light on recent debates about executive orders. Exactly. I want to say this is the reason why I mentioned the War Powers Act. Of course, it had not been powered yet, or had not been empowered yet. But this is Abraham Lincoln thinking as a modern president and essentially in many ways anticipating what would be done when it comes to US presidency and executive powers with respect to their position as commander-in-chief. Exactly, Lincoln invented the war powers of the president. Not entirely, but I would probably say he was the first modern, he had the first modern approach when it comes to war powers, I would say. The prelude of the proclamation is in the New York State Museum in Lincoln's own handwriting. Please see it. It is a masterpiece. It is, when it comes to any relic that we have in New York State, when it comes to the Emancipation, this, in my opinion, is Abraham Lincoln's greatest achievement. As I said, when it comes to so many of the challenges that he faced as president, he could have ended the Civil War without freeing slavery. He could have lost the Civil War without freeing slavery. What he did over here, and again, this is a man who had maybe about 1 year total of formal education. This is something that is almost worthy of comparison to the Bill of Rights or the whole of the Federalist Papers in terms of what he was able to do and how he was able to understand the, essentially not so much the loopholes, but the opportunities that the US Constitution could provide a president in his situation. So that does wrap up last week's discussion on 1862. If you want, anyone, feel free to get a drink or have a quick break for a moment. I do want us to continue the main focus of our subject today, which is 1863 and the arming of Black soldiers, the enlistment of them into the United States military, and ultimately the incredibly consequential events of 1863, both in the Eastern theaters and the Western theaters. So just a brief refresher, when it comes to the Civil War. Yes?
No, I was just an observation. As we know, nowadays, lawyers kind of get a bad press for any number of reasons. But if I was a member of the bar or a bar association, I would certainly have Lincoln high up in the logo or the icon because example of lawyerly ability at its best. And of course, it depends on where you're coming from. If you're, a member of the Confederacy, you probably see it in a different lens. But certainly from the Union standpoint, he was brilliant.
I've actually shared this class with, when I first offered it at the Albany Institute of History and Art about 4 or 5 years ago. We had people in the attendance who were Civil War reenactors, people who were accountants, people who had served in the military. I particularly enjoyed one of our guests who was a lobbyist, and she was saying if Lincoln was alive today, no matter what he was doing, he would have been successful. He was a governor, he would have been successful, a legislator, a justice, he would have been successful. And it's worth mentioning that when it comes to Lincoln, not only with his with his abilities when it comes to law, but from every report during the time period, they said he was the funniest person anybody had met during the time period. They said he would tell all these yarns, all these anecdotes. They said that he was an incredible physical athlete. Individuals in Illinois that knew him when he was young said he was the strongest person that they had ever met. He could lift like a bale of hay that was several hundred pounds. He actually judged cockfights. He was an incredible wrestler during the time period. So he had so many, he just had this remarkable reputation. And it is worth mentioning that during this time period, he would have been considered a Westerner as president. So essentially, it's something almost akin to Teddy Roosevelt with his reputation, being this cowboy, being this rugged individual who goes to the West and the frontiers. Lincoln would have a reputation somewhat akin, especially in New England and New York, as almost something like a country bumpkin. But he was incredibly charismatic and charming. And one of the greatest things about him is he was incredibly good at self-deprecating humor. We've actually read some of the books that Lincoln read, joke books, and it's incredible. Like in terms of his own comedy, he was a master of making fun of himself. One of my favorite examples of that is one story was he was accused of being two-faced. And Abraham Lincoln, keep in mind, he has a lost accent, but we have an idea that it would have not sounded like a New England, New York accent, and that it was described by people at the time high and somewhat a little bit shrill on occasion. So Daniel Day-Lewis does a very good job at it. Abraham Lincoln, when he was accused of having two faces, said, "I was a man of two faces. Would I be wearing this?" Guy's a genius. He diffuses criticism that way. And it's worth mentioning that according to Abraham Lincoln's own wife, Mary Todd, in letters, Lincoln at the time was considered extremely unattractive. Now, moving on, when it comes to the Eastern Theater, main focus for this year is going to be the conflicts between Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia and the Army of the Potomac. And just one thing in chat, macabre point. Oh yeah, I just want to read this from the chat. The early 1980s, on the second floor of the New York State Capitol, there were displayed cases with artifacts. One of the artifacts on display was the handkerchief with Lincoln's blood on it. There was a custom in the 19th and early 20th century for bystanders to dip handkerchiefs in blood as souvenirs. It is actually, I have researched this quite a lot. For my first novel, The Great Abraham Lincoln Pocket Conspiracy, see it right over my shoulder. For that, I did work with Ford's Theater quite a lot when it came to understanding the location of Lincoln's relics and everything associated with his assassination. When he was assassinated, people went into the box he was in. They took out pocket knives, cut off like 3 square inch sections of the wallpaper. It's almost akin to the same sort of reverence you might see in the Roman Catholic Church when it comes to holy relics. And that there was just this bizarre phenomenon individuals had of collecting individual artifacts, locks of hair, fractions of blood of some of these people during this time period. I'd probably say psychologically, I mean, I'm not a psychologist, but I could say that when it comes to one reason why this might have been done is the fact that there's no internet during this time period. So many people are living very local lives, and having something akin to an artifact from this time period is a way of sort of confirming that it actually exists. So one example from my own experiences, I met Barack Obama in 2008 when I was volunteering and eventually working for his campaign. And it is quite unusual where you go seeing someone on TV, reading about them in newspapers, and then physically interacting with them, shaking their hand, bumping, like in my case, I bumped my middle finger against his wedding ring when I was shaking his hand. So those kind of things in the time period where there would have been much less physical interaction with some of these people simply due to mobility during the time or lack of, that it appears that this would have something akin to serving as a surrogate to that person, knowing someone who shook Lincoln's hand, knowing someone who has a lock of Lincoln's hair. It shows that Lincoln was a real person, did exist, and did affect these people. So going on for our discussion, when it comes to the Western Theater, this is where we're going to be focusing on Ulysses S. Grant and his Vicksburg campaign. It's worth mentioning that even though this is the subject of many, many books, that when it comes to Ron Chernow's book, my favorite aspect of Grant from Ron Chernow's writings is he does a very good job at emphasizing Grant's genius when it comes to the Vicksburg campaign. And he was the first person I ever read who made a pretty compelling case that Grant might have actually been able to defeat Napoleon, because when it comes to Napoleon, Napoleon, like Robert E. Lee, suffered from the fault of being able to win battles but not win campaigns, and or at the very least not be able to recover from campaigns that they lost. Grant was someone who was able to keep his mind completely focused on the campaigns that he was launching, and that wouldn't allow some cases horrible casualties or very demoralizing situations stand in the way of his eventual success in them. And also, this is going to be the first year that the Emancipation takes effect. When it was originally announced, it would take effect on January 1st, 1863. And this is going to be where we see the first engagements with Black soldiers. This is also where we see the Civil War take on probably its most controversial nature, because this is where we start seeing the conscription of Union soldiers for the first time. And now the Civil War is being fought not only because of Union, but also because of emancipation. And as some of you might have seen in the movie Gangs of New York, or if some of you might have researched when it comes to your own approach to the Civil War, that emancipation, according to those around Lincoln, according to the chairman of the Republican Party, becomes an incredibly decisive issue and an incredibly destructive one for Lincoln's reelection chances during these first few years of the Emancipation Institution. So very quickly, when it comes to the Union situation during this time period, 1862 is probably the first year where we really see the Anaconda Plan reaching its maturity militarily. When it was first laid out by General Scott, it was considered quixotic. It was considered to be giving too much power to the Confederacy. They thought the war would not be that long. And ultimately, by 1863, we start seeing the Union in a position where it could completely control the Mississippi River, where it could be able to penetrate into the Tennessee Valley. Now, the first thing I want to do is I want to quickly touch up on one of the last and really one of the biggest battles in the entire Civil War, which is the Battle of Fredericksburg. In terms of deployed soldiers actually present on the battlefield, numerically, this is the largest engagement of the entire Civil War. The Battle of Fredericksburg, which took place in December 62, has the largest amounts of troops that are on the battlefield, and mostly because of the Union Army during this time period. And General Ambrose Burnside, who I'm sure many of you might have heard of because of his incredible facial hair, he was in charge of the Union during this time, an enormous army, and he crossed the Rappahannock River on pontoon bridges, went through the town of Fredericksburg, which would have had sharpshooters throughout it, and he did a devastating series of attacks on Confederate forces, 3 trenches deep over here in an area known as Mary's Heights. So right over here, this was one of the most devastating actions the Union does during the war. This is the most lopsided battle for the Union in terms of casualties. And this is one where Burnside himself was so devastated by the loss of life, he said he wept openly. He said he even volunteered to personally lead another attack on Mary's Heights, and he was persuaded out of it. So it's at this time period going into the war that Robert E. Lee's army, despite their repulse over at the Battle of Antietam, they do start developing their image of invulnerability. And the reason why I'm starting off with this discussion for 62 is because this Union defeat over at Fredericksburg is going to be somewhat consequential when it comes to the events that happen at the Battle of Gettysburg. So going on, let's see, right over here, just wanted to quickly show again, this is a photograph of Mary's Heights. This is where we would have had several rows of riflemen behind a stone wall, and just the devastating results of it afterwards. I should mention that some of these photographs, I'm sorry to say, were staged. During the Civil War, we did not see uniformly the respect for the dead that we now have now. There were better efforts to try to bury the dead, and both a Union and Confederate. But unfortunately, during this time period, I don't know if we can see this clearly on the figure at the bottom left, but when it comes to battlefields, we would have scavengers just lurking in bushes to take away the teeth of the dead to be used in dentures, to be able to purloin whatever personal items they could during this time period. And even when it comes to some of the photographers, to actually arrange some of the bodies in dramatic positions for their photography. And yes, over here, when it comes to Battle of Fredericksburg, I'm really showing this just again to emphasize how enormous the Union Army was during this time, roughly about 100,000 soldiers. I've seen even more than 100,000 soldiers during this time period. and they would have been engaging, suffering. I think I saw something like 10% casualties from what happened. In the case of some of the soldiers that would be attacked, specifically at Mary's Heights, they would be suffering overwhelming casualties as a result. So following the Battle of Fredericksburg, which you can see on this map at the very bottom midpoint between the blue and the red lines over here. So after the Battle of Fredericksburg and going into the year 1863, Robert E. Lee finds himself in something akin to almost a little bit like a caucus ticket. He's in a situation where even though he was able to enjoy incredible victories when it comes to the Battle of Fredericksburg, he still feels that he hasn't been able to force the Union into a position where the Union is no longer able to fight a war. So what he's trying to do in this case is he wants to invade the Union again. He's essentially doing a replay of his original strategy when he was invading through Maryland, which was primarily to roughly go up to Harrisburg and either bait the Union Army into being defeated, or force the Union into a position where the Union might overextend itself trying to defend Washington, D.C., Baltimore, even Philadelphia, I've heard being mentioned. And so what we have over here is General Joe Hooker, again of New York, takes command of the Union. And we see the Union and the Confederates marching in roughly parallel lines, eventually leading up to the Battle of Gettysburg. Before this happens, there is an enormous engagement that takes place at the Battle of Chancellorsville. In terms of military science, Chancellorsville is considered Robert E. Lee's biggest victory. This is where he took the longest odds. He was in a situation where he was outnumbered almost 3-1 by the Union, because what Joe Hooker was doing is he was condensing as many of his soldiers as he could, and he believed that he would have this overwhelming army and make a drive for Richmond. And make no mistake, Joe Hooker, he earned his reputation as Fighting Joe. He shows his bravery later on during the Battle of Lookout Mountain when it comes to Battle of Chattanooga. And he was someone who truly wanted to bring the fight to Robert E. Lee. The problem is Robert E. Lee during the Battle of Chancellorsville, he just moves throughout the entire battlefield so quickly. This is probably the best use we see of General Thomas Jefferson Stonewall Jackson. You can see over here the beginning of the situation. They're in a forested land, also known as the wilderness, over here on the west side of the map. And we just see General Jackson completely moving his army through this woodlands where they were able to understand how to pass through them better than the Union did. They said that, if I'm not mistaken, I heard that General Jackson had like this map that was roughly like 9 or 13 feet long, this incredibly detailed map that just had all these little known roads, passageways throughout the Shenandoah Valley and throughout Virginia. And when it comes to the Union during this time period, they said that the Union would be so lost, they'd be trying to navigate the forest by compass. They'd be trying to purchase maps from anyone they could see during this time period. And ultimately, we see the Union not only in a position where their large armies now being forced into a defense in very chaotic battlefields when it comes to Chancellorsville, but what happens is Joe Hooker was actually leaning on a pillar of a home, his headquarters, and the pillar was actually hit by a cannonball, and he was briefly knocked out. And while he was discombobulated during this time period, he made what it now looks like was the mistake that he did not pass command to someone else. There's an apocryphal story that goes around that says, Joe Hooker says, "I lost faith in Joe Hooker that day." That is essentially a paraphrasing. I've researched the historiography of that passage. And what did happen is he was, of course, physically unwell after surviving that barrage, but he was also in a position where it's not so much that he lost faith in Joe Hooker. He was injured. He didn't want to relieve command because he believed if he relieved command that the Union would be completely routed. So there is some wisdom in that decision that he does. But ultimately what happens is the Union is forced into a rather hopeless defensive position where they're going to be attacked from almost 3 sides. And thus the enormity of the Union Army is not to their advantage whatsoever. This is what's known as a force multiplication in military science. Force multiplication is where you force your opponents into, say, a bottleneck, so that as a result, the enormity of their army is completely useless, because it all comes down to how much fire can you concentrate on the defenders at that time period. And here, using Chancellorsville, which unlike the rest of the area, The reason why so much of the fighting took place at Chancellorsville is because, unlike the rest of the wilderness, Chancellorsville had less forests in there. So you can more easily marshal soldiers, line them up in defensive positions. The problem is when it comes to the Confederates that would be invading this time, they would actually use the uncertainty of the wilderness to their advantage. They would be charging through forests. They would be surprising the Union during this time. The Union is overwhelmingly rattled during this time. And it's worth mentioning that after the retreat, Abraham Lincoln, he hears about what happened in Fredericksburg, and emotionally he was devastated. He was quoted saying, my God, what would the country say?" According to the diary of Gideon Wells, it looks like Edwin Stanton was actually afraid that Lincoln might commit suicide after this battle. It was a devastating loss for the Union militarily and psychologically. And one thing I do want to mention is that there was a skeleton unit that was over at Fredericksburg during this time period. And once Hooker is forced into a defensive position, the skeleton unit tries to attack, and not only where the Confederates are more vulnerable, but also tries to reinforce Hooker's position. And Robert E. Lee, same thing as before, is just able to force them into a corner. You can see the river is to their back, attack them from 3 different sides. Here we have the enormity of the Army of the Potomac isolated into a point where, as devastating as this could have potentially been even worse for the Union. We could have lost, or the Union could have lost half of their army when it came to this battle. So the victory at Chancellorsville, which comes at a heavy cost, even though this is considered Lee's greatest victory, General Jackson, he's eventually shot by picket men. He's injured in friendly fire, and then he shortly dies of pneumonia, complications that comes upon his arm being amputated. So Robert E. Lee finds himself in command of an army that believes that he's invincible. I have heard, or I have read from psychological evaluations of Lee, that it appears that Lee was starting to believe in his own invincibility during this time period. Chancellorsville in particular, Lee should not have won that battle. Militarily, he was completely outnumbered. General Joe Hooker was not like the previous generals. He was someone who really wanted to bring a fight to the Confederates. And after his victory there, he and his own army believed that he could do almost anything. So this is where we see the parallel units that are marching Union and Confederate over to Gettysburg. It's worth mentioning that the Union wanted to have itself in a position where they would have their back to Washington, D.C. for twofold. One, so they could defend Washington, D.C. from the front lines, and also because Washington, D.C. was able to bring in reinforcements to safeguard them. It is worth mentioning that I have recently wrote an essay on the defenses of Washington, D.C. during this time period, and it would have been devastating for Lee to attack Washington. So Washington was a little bit more useful as essentially a little bit useful for the threat that it might have, somewhat akin to East and West Berlin during the Cold War, in the sense that even though Washington, D.C. was an incredible Union stronghold, and so very important when it comes to the Union war effort, for the Confederate perspectives, it was a little bit better to threaten Washington, D.C. than to actually march a force into Washington. Because during this time period, Washington is the most heavily fortified city on earth. So moving on, I do want to show that the dotted line that you see that crisscrosses across the Union in the south and then makes an approach to Washington and rides north, those are the cavalry units by Jeb Stuart, and it's actually incredibly foolish what Jeb Stuart does, because this cavalry is supposed to be the vanguard for Robert E. Lee. They're supposed to be riding in front, getting information, reporting where the Union soldiers are, and it looks like somewhat guided by ego. Stuart was riding all over the place. He was capturing equipment, getting his name in the newspapers, and Lee was supposed to be furious about this. He wanted to know where his cavalry was. He wanted to know the information about where the Union was, and he didn't have any of that. So for that reason, Jeb Stuart ends up playing a very consequential role in terms of the rather devastating situation the Confederates find themselves in Gettysburg. Sorry about that. I'm having a little bit of allergies right now. So when it comes to Gettysburg, fought over the course of 3 days, this is fairly called the most consequential battle of the Civil War. It doesn't end the war, but it's definitely one of the turning points in the war, marking a moment where the Confederacy essentially realizes their own military limitations. When it comes to Gettysburg, the Union was able to survive devastations like Gettysburg when they were on the losing side, but the Confederacy is not able to. And not only that, as this is going on, we have General Grant outside of Vicksburg sieging that capital, or that stronghold, I should say, for the Confederates on the Mississippi River. So starting off, when Lee's approaching Gettysburg, we have Union forces under John Reynolds, who's actually killed by a sniper on the very first day of battle. And Doubleday, they reinforce some dismounted cavalry commanded by John Buford, who is one of the first to arrive at Gettysburg. And the main effort that they're doing is they are doing a delayed retreat. They're trying to keep the Confederates at bay long enough in order to reinforce the very desirable positioning over at Cemetery Hill. Now, for those of you who are interested in traveling this summer, I don't know if you've ever been to Gettysburg, but it is a beautiful battlefield. It's one way that I've described it is it's almost like Hollywood in the sense that it has so many different types of geography there. It has rocky knolls that look like they could be, from, I don't know, possibly like from Colorado. It has beautiful forests, flat farmlands. It just has this very diverse battlefield. And according to the generals themselves that were going there, and keep in mind, these generals are meant to be looking at battlefields as if surgeons, like saying, all right, this is valuable, we should be reinforcing this. Many generals that were at Gettysburg said it was the most beautiful battlefield they had ever been to. So if any of you are interested, with everyone getting their vaccinations and travel being somewhat increased, if you are looking for a place to go, I would recommend Gettysburg. It's a beautiful location that you can explore while still socially distancing. So by the end of the first day, what you see is not how the second day Gettysburg actually unfolded. This is actually Lee's plan. So we have the Union in what was known at the time as a fishhook positioning, where they were defending this bend going around an area known as Colts Hill over at the east, over to Cemetery Hill over here on the west. It's worth mentioning that when it comes to Gettysburg, we have so much writing on it, so many anecdotes. And one thing that is interesting is at Cemetery Hill, called that because they had a graveyard over there, there was a sign saying that anyone bringing firearms into this cemetery will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. So you get to see some of the transformation of local history when it comes to Gettysburg. So as you can see over here, Lee's plan is actually not too dissimilar from the actions that he did when it came to Chancellorsville, where he was having the Union Army forced in a position where he could attack in 3 different directions. What his approach was going to do is he was going to have General Ewell threaten the Union on Colts Hill, where it's worth mentioning Colts Hill, a lot of fighting takes place over here. Colts Hill doesn't get enough attention when it comes to Civil War scholarship. It was one of the more steep hills during the time period, fierce fighting over there. And the Confederates, I guess you could say, even though what they're doing seems like a feint, it's not a feint, it's like a very strong feint. The kind of thing where, if possible, he would have liked to break through into the Union lines, but unfortunately that never happens. And they're also going to be doing a little bit more of a feint on Cemetery Ridge. This is going to be the most heavily defended area for the Union. But what Lee really wants to do is he wants General Longstreet, who it's worth mentioning, Longstreet has taken over command of Stonewall Jackson's corps. Longstreet is going to be doing a massive attack through these regions known as the Peach Orchard, Devil's Den, which is this incredibly rocky area over there. And he's going to try to flank the Union lines from the west, possibly get behind them. And what he can do in that case is possibly envelop the entire Union Army during this time period. Make no mistake, this is, during the rather archaic methods that they're using, this is a pretty good strategy. It's just several crazy things happen, crazy specifically because of a New Yorker's role in it, that ultimately result in a very different second day. What happens is New York's own general, Daniel Sickles, who, if any of you are looking for a colorful character to read about, read the book Sickles the Incredible. Dan Sickles is, well, they said he was the first American to successfully defend himself in a temporary insanity plea after he murdered Francis Scott Key's son for sleeping with his wife. He was someone who basically had a ruined reputation in Tammany Hall politics, which is tough to do. And eventually he joins the Union Army as a way of sort of re-entering politics and government. He's someone who's essentially, he's someone who I guess we would call now today tarnished goods politically, and he's trying to rebuild his reputation. So what happens is during day 2 of the Battle of Gettysburg, he finds himself on the western edge of the fishhook. And according to many different accounts, there's been a lot of writing on what he does here. He did not like his defenses. So he looked ahead and he saw that the Peach Orchard and really Devil's Den, which was this very heavily rocky knoll area, he was thinking, well, why am I standing here in a field? I want to go behind those big rocks. So he moves his units over there. And then he immediately realizes he made a huge mistake because the entire corps with General Longstreet commanding is approaching him, and it's going to be a slaughter fest. According to the generals who saw what Sickles was doing, they said, well, he's going to ride out there and he's going to be bounced all the way back. And eventually he's actually injured. He loses his leg. A shell goes off right by him. He loses a leg, falls off his horse. When he was taken off the battlefield, they said, General, where's your corps? He said, dead on the field. So horrendous casualties were suffered over at the Peach Orchard in Devil's Den. And again, this is what I was saying, where I said that Gettysburg at places is almost like Hollywood, in the sense that it almost has like these set pieces throughout the entire region that looks like could be a different part of the United States. And as you can see over here, these incredibly heavy stones, according to one criticism, is that the Union didn't even need bullets. They could have just rolled rocks at the Confederates. So it's an incredibly bloody fight around here. All these nicknames that it gets: Devil's Den, Devil's Bath, the Slaughterhouse. You can imagine how those areas got the name. And over here, we actually have General Sickles' leg, which he himself preserved and actually kept in a little box that he would use on display every now and then. If I'm not mistaken, I believe it's at Walter Reed Hospital now. So now what's interesting is there's been a lot of controversy over Sickles' decision to be out of position on day 2. According to General Longstreet himself after the war, he said that this decision by Sickles, in General Longstreet's opinion, won the battle for the Union because he wasn't able to execute the order that Lee had given him, which was to fight the Confederates. And furthermore, Longstreet believed that his soldiers were so weakened during this time period that they could no longer be enough of a fighting threat to be able to take what they soon realized was the most important territory on the Union flank, which was this little area here known as Little Round Top, where the Union and the Confederates are in a huge rush to reinforce this somewhat wooded and also somewhat rocky hill right over here. From what I understood about, from what I've researched on it, there would have been somewhat more trees here during the time the Union would have been defending it during the Battle of Gettysburg. And just to put in perspective, some idea of the sense of scale, what you see over here is Devil's Den. This is where so much of the fighting was taking place with Sickles' units. This is the view of Devil's Den from the pinnacle of Little Round Top. So just illustrating over here that this is a relatively small battle where you can visually see so much of the action that's going on around you. If you're in a high position, as you are over here, you can see the enemies that would be attacking you. And the Union knew that even though they were able to severely weaken General Longstreet's troops, that they still had a lot of fight in them. In my opinion, I believe this actually backs up General Longstreet's assessment that it was actually very felicitous that General Sickles had moved his troops into this position, because even after going through that slaughterhouse, and that's literally the name they called it, the slaughterhouse at Devil's Den, they still had a lot of fight in them in order to challenge Little Round Top. So when it comes to Little Round Top itself, you can see over here the individual regiments that would be defending it. The extreme one that we know about, and I should say, all these soldiers, this was the days that essentially they went into the history books. It's just because of the popularity of the movie Gettysburg, and really because of the man Joshua Lawrence, excuse me, Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, just being an incredibly well-spoken person and a beautiful writer and philosopher, that we focus a little bit more on the ultimate extreme of the Little Round Top defenses, which is this little wedge over here that was controlled by the 20th Maine with Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain in command. So what happens is the Confederate forces that are coming against the Union during this time, the Union is very urgently rushed over there. They're undermanned. They're in a position where many of the soldiers weren't even supposed to be fighting. Many of their enlistments had expired during this time period. And they find themselves in a position where the Union fires until they run out of ammo. They use the ammo of their fallen soldiers until they're out. And they do what I was mentioning before is considered an unorthodox technique during this time, With their ammunition almost completely spent, they fix their bayonets and they charge down the hill for hand-to-hand combat. As I said before, we have analyses from doctors during the time period, and essentially when it comes to bayonet wounds, they're rather low when it comes to the amount of dead during the Civil War. When it comes to art, I have a comment over here in art. What was the name of the Sickles book that I recommended? It's a very easy title to remember. Sickles the Incredible. It's probably the most entertaining book you'll read on Sickles. There was a recent one that came out that received a lot of publicity, American Scoundrel. That one, as like I said, Sickles is a very controversial figure. And there's a lot of people in the North who feel that he almost lost the Civil War. There's some people on the North, from the Northern historians, who believe that he actually saved the Civil War at Gettysburg. I recommend Sickles the Incredible as opposed to American Scoundrel, because when it comes to Sickles, you need to understand everything about him. He had a career before the Civil War, afterwards, and that book really covered everything. So I recommend Sickles the Incredible, which was actually recommended to me when I was first a student going to Gettysburg with my class for research. So just to wrap things up, because I know that our hour is almost over, what happens is the Union forces over here, essentially Colonel Chamberlain is essentially able to have the Union defenses almost hinge like a fence, and they're able to force the Alabama regiment they were engaging to be under attack from two directions. Worth mentioning that that unit from Alabama had never been defeated before. It's the first defeat that they got. And the Union is able to reinforce Little Round Top in time for them to basically save the Union flank from being developed. Now, it's worth mentioning that Robert E. Lee, in terms of his mindset, he was not in a very smart position. Robert E. Lee believed the second day had been a Confederate victory. Even though Longstreet disagreed with him, he believed that they had achieved none of their objectives. Both sides had suffered extreme casualties. And Longstreet was beginning to think that the longer they were staying in this position, the more heavily fortified the Union was becoming. So when it comes to what happens the next day, where Robert E. Lee gives the order for many different Confederate divisions to be attacking the heavily defended areas at Cemetery Ridge, Longstreet didn't want to give the order. He wanted to retreat from Gettysburg and reposition themselves between the Union Army and Washington, D.C. as a way of baiting the Union into attacking them. But basically, from what I've read in terms of assessments of Lee's mindset, he said Lee's blood was up. He didn't want to retreat from the battlefield. He believed he could defeat the Union here. He was someone who believed it would be an insult to his soldiers to leave this battlefield after all their fighting. That mindset is Lee's undoing, not only at the Battle of Gettysburg, but as a general, because I'm of the opinion that it's that mindset that Lee had that was going to be disastrous at some point in his career. And the fact that it hadn't happened yet was in some cases miraculous, or other cases just lucky. So when it happens, so what we start seeing here during the third day of the Battle of Gettysburg, if this wasn't going to happen at Gettysburg, this might have happened at Harrisburg, might have happened outside the gates of Washington, D.C. The point is the Confederates had always been using a very disastrous method of warfighting with Robert E. Lee and with his very aggressive charges into enemy territory and into defensive lines. And it's at the Bloody Angle, it's called, of Cemetery Ridge, where the Confederacy reaches what's called the high water point, basically the closest in terms of Confederate mythology they ever came to having their independence. It's a devastating battle. The initial Confederate barrage that they do of artillery overshots the Union lines. The Confederates are able to briefly penetrate the Union forces here, but this is a devastatingly unwise approach that the Confederates do. And it looks at General Longstreet himself. Keep in mind, Longstreet was the defender at Marye's Heights during the Battle of Fredericksburg. He did not want to give the order. He actually, without a word, nodded when he was asked by Pickett whether or not to do the attack. And this is one of the most iconic images of the entire Civil War, the defeat of the Confederates during Pickett's charge on day 3 of the Battle of Gettysburg. So with that said, I am going to have us revisit the Battle of, or the Siege of Vicksburg next class before we go into the final years of the war. But that said, I do know we went over time a little bit. I apologize about that. Gettysburg itself could be an entire class on its own. There's so much writing on it. But that said, and of course, when it comes to readings, there's a reason why Michael Shower's The Killer Angels is so praised, not only by historians, but even by generals. General Norman Schwarzkopf is a huge fan of The Killer Angels. It does a fantastic job at recreating the minds and the personalities of these real people who came into the Battle of Gettysburg. So if you are interested, I would recommend reading the book, The Killer Angels by Michael Shara. And I would also recommend a shorter work, but is very good for a very detailed history of the Civil War, is called The American Iliad. You do a search for American Iliad. It's a textbook that I was given when I was a college student. And it still looks to me, in terms of the amount of pages, probably the best concise history of the Civil War that focuses very much on the military side. So I would recommend that if anyone else is interested. And also the National Park Service has a very good companion booklet, almost like a brochure, which is essentially of all their maps that are national park sites in the country. Those maps give a very good summary of almost any of those battles. So I do recommend, if any of you are interested in further reading, try any of those 3 books that I suggested over here. With that said, anybody have any final thoughts before we part for the day? I just see some comments over here. My pleasure. All right, if there's no questions, thank you so much for a very wonderful class. Feel free to email me any questions you might have additionally before we pass. Otherwise, thank you very much. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.